the spirit dies without the symbol. And we've begun to chip away at the symbols of our cultural symbols. We've given up dharma for secularism. We've given up Gurukulam Pathshala for convent education. We've given up Diwali for Halloween. We don't celebrate Diwali as Americans in the US. Indians may celebrate it. I don't see white people and black people celebrating Diwali over here. Why should Indian people in Mumbai and Delhi have Halloween parties? Why should we have Christmas parties? Why should, I have many Hindu friends who go to the church to do Christmas mass. I don't see Christians going to the mandir during Navratri. We've been traumatized as a nation of Hindus into thinking that we are an inferior species. And just as a person who is traumatized in life is not able to get through it without any external help, we have begun to seek validation externally in order to pull us out of this mess. Whereas we should start looking more inwards and finding out more about our own journey and passing it on to our children. It is a pleasure to connect with all of you and also our audience who have joined us today. We are trying to break new ground in terms of bringing together different thematic elements from disparate subject matters. So oftentimes we come across people who say, okay, the Vedas are scientific, and some people say it is not scientific, and so on and so forth. And these almost irrelevant back and forth debates which don't come to any solid conclusion. And so what we are actually trying to do is plumb the depths of what the Shastras speak about, as well as understand more about the world through different forms of literature, scientific literature, so on and so forth, and try to find parallels in these systems. And in the process, we are also debunking many myths that are associated with some of these presumptions. And so this is one of the attempts of our podcasting channel. And also the goal of the podcast eventually is to take each individual subject matter, bounce it back and forth with an interlocutor. So I'm having a conversation with a friend of mine, with Lekha, who's also interested into in the same area. And through our conversations, we are trying to arrive and break new grounds in terms of the discussions and the things that can be arrived through it. So eventually each episode would end up being a chapter in a given book. And so the topic today that we are going to be discussing, which is Dharma, the Vedic vision of reality, is also going to be one such subject matter that would feature in the book eventually. And I'm very excited to discuss this with you. So the topic today is Dharma, the Vedic vision of reality. And I'll just begin with a Mangalacharan. Ratnakara Deutapadam Himalaya Kiritinim Brahmarajashi Ratnadyam Vande Bharatmataram Om. So we begin with the simple question, what exactly is Dharma? And we find that generally speaking, people have imputed many different meanings behind this word Dharma. Some people say it means religion, others call it duty. And then if you look at it scripturally speaking, it's also referred to as the inherent property of the padarthas, of the different substances that we find in the world. And then sometimes it is also referred to as the ethical principles. And so through this talk, we are going to be exploring each one of these in great detail and trying to really arrive at a fuller picture of Dharma. So the way I really see it is that let's say we have an image which is comprised of multiple pixels. And the more pixels you have, the clearer the resolution, and it stands out to you as a very stark, beautiful, fully fledged image, which is what we are trying to arrive at through our explanation and understanding of Dharma. So just to understand a little bit of etymology, Dharma comes from the Sanskrit dhatu dhr, which means to hold or sustain or to keep in place. And so it gives you the sense of something being grounded. And here the grounding isn't just being grounded in terms of oneself as a person, but it speaks of the grounding of the fabric of reality itself. And we will be exploring and touching upon this theme in much greater detail throughout this talk. Now, Dharma is not confined to any one aspect of life, but it pervades all of them. And another word that can be used interchangeably, but not quite, but in some sense, is the word ritam. Ritam. So, there's a Shanti mantra called Ritam Vadishyami, Satyam Vadishyami, Tanmamrita Tadvikarmrita. So, all of these words indicate that there is an order which was pervading this cosmos. There is an order which is holding all of the things in its place. And this is what we refer to when we say the word Dharma. And of course, when we speak about our tradition that we follow, that we adhere to, Sanatana Dharma, the prefix Sanatana is actually referring to something being unborn, uncreated, beginningless. And so when we speak about the word dharma, Sanatana is almost redundant, but the reason we use it is more of a dequalifier than a qualifier. So one may think that, okay, did dharma begin at some point in time? For example, if you think about the prophetic religions, the Abrahamic religions, all of them have a founding father, or they have some point in time in which they came about. So one may also wonder that, okay, what about the dharma that we follow? Did it come about at some time? Was it the creation of a singular person? And the word Sanatana is a dequalifier because it takes away that presumption that dharma came about in time, because dharma is something that is beginningless. And the reason why it is beginningless is also something that we will see as we go through. So the first understanding of dharma we refer to as the rhythm is something that we'll be touching upon. Now, if you look at the world around you, probably in front of you, you're viewing this on a laptop or on a cell phone. And so things are held in its place. Your table will remain where it is. Your monitor will continue to function the way it is, more or less. And when you wake up the next day, the sun is still going to rise from the east. So whatever that we perceive around us in the world is immutably held in its place, and there is a certain order that weaves through the fabric of reality. So that is one thing to keep in mind. And the things around us also possess immutable properties. So let's say we think about a proton, which exerts a certain positive charge, and electron may exert a negative charge. All of these charges are well defined, they are well understood, they can be quantified. You can put them as part of an equation and solve problems. You can create technology out of this understanding. And it is only because these properties are immutable, which is why we can actually do things with them. Even the use of our technology, the computer, for instance, relies upon our understanding of the physical world. And so that is also dharma, because that which holds things in its place, that we spoke about, the dhatu dhar, and also something having immutable properties, the property of a substance is also dharma. Now, the world around us follows certain laws. Whenever we write an equation, whether it's a mathematical equation, a scientific equation, any form of a construct that we come about, depends upon the laws being followed through time. So let's say we take the simple example of E equals mc square. That there is a correlation between energy and mass is not something that is going to change, it's going to be invariable. And that is the only reason an equation works. An equation cannot work until and unless there is some fixed standard and a structure that is inherent to the world and the properties that are inherent to the world. And so this is also what we refer to as part of the order. And there is a new subject matter that has come about in the last 50 or so years, which is called the chaos theory. And so we've all heard about chaotic systems. We've heard of system dynamics. We've heard of complexity, randomness, entropy, all of these words which talk about how certain things are indeterministic. But even the things which are seemingly indeterministic are following a certain order. And therefore, even the whole concept of chaos is embedded within the broader and larger framework of something that is the order. Lastly, we speak about nature and the categories that define it. And so, whenever we study a subject matter, we assign it a certain name, right? So, for example, if we are studying the physical cosmos, we refer to it as physics. If we are looking at the interaction of different elements and how they form compounds, then we enter the realm of chemistry. When these chemical substances, form biological beings, and we speak about organisms, then we've entered the realm of biology. But in truth, any subject that it is that we are studying, all we are truly delving into is nature. And it is this nature, nature derives its properties again through the principles of dharma. So everything in nature is determined by a certain dharmic framework. And the study of dharma is something that we assign labels to, and we refer to it as separate subjects based on the specializations that we are trying to form. So the next thing I'd like to discuss is the idea of Ishvara. And so when we speak about the world, there's this question: how did the world come about? And Shastra refers to Ishvara as a Jagat Karana. So the word Karana refers to the cause, and Ishvara is supposed to be both the Nimitta Karana and the Upadana Karana. So when we look at the Nimitta Karana, The Nimitta Karana is the efficient cause, but we want to make the clear distinction that this is not the Abrahamic notion of intelligent design, because that is, of course, a concept that is appropriately looked down upon, and it refers to some deity, some entity that is sitting outside the universe, pulling the strings, and just making things happen without any rational explanation. Whereas when we speak about the Nimitta Karana, Ishvara is meant to be understood both in the context of the Nimitta and the Upadana Karana, because Ishvara is not only the efficient cause, the one who brings about the cosmos through the intelligence and the laws that are inherent to the cosmos, but is also the very product of the cosmos. And so we will look into that a little bit more. Um, so when we speak about the Upadana Karana, so let's say we are trying to build a pot. The pot would require material in the form of clay. Now the universe is obviously made of stuff. There's matter and energy which is pervading the cosmos. And so where does this stuff come from? Is it something that Ishvara created? Is it something that Ishvara molded and then just sent out to the physical world to do its thing? And the answer to that is no. Ishvara itself is the Upadana Karana. The very content of the Jagat that we refer to, that we look around, that we interact with, that we perceive, all of it is nothing but Ishvara. And therefore, Ishvara is both the efficient cause and the Upadana Karanam. Now, whenever we think about the world and we speak about different categories, they are very malleable categories. For example, let's say we draw a distinction between Vijatiya, Sajatiya, and Swagata Bhed. So there are three distinctions that are there in this world. Let's say we talk about the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. So you have an object called a tree, and then you may have an object or a thing like a deer. So obviously these belong to different categories. But even so, this is what you will call Vijatiya Bhed, because they belong to different species. So the Jati here refers to the species. But even within, let's say, the plant kingdom, you could have many different types of plants. You could have, you could have an apple tree, you could have a cherry tree, you could have all sorts of distinctions even within that. And so within a certain jati, you will have distinctions between members of that jati, and that is what you refer to as a Sajatiya Bhed. Now, let's say we are looking at just one member of the jati. We can call it a coconut tree. So now the coconut tree itself will again be subject to the three divisions all over again, because a coconut tree will have the coconut fruit, and then you will have the fronds, and you'll have the bark, and you'll have the roots. And so then those are the Vijatiya Bhed of a single um, entity, a single member within the same species. And then again, within, let's say, within the leaf, you'll have distinctions there, because one leaf may be of a different length than the other, and so on and so forth. Now, even when you come to the molecular level, you have distinctions between different compounds. You have, even within the same type of compound, let's say you have a hydrogen atom, you have one atom which is located in a certain place and time, and then you have a different atom somewhere else. And so these Bhedas continue on and forth, and there is no end to it. So as long as we speak about the physical world, and as long as we perceive the world around us, there will always be further distinctions, and there is no end to this. Now, whenever we speak of an object, we are never speaking about the thing itself. We are always speaking about a conglomerate. So let's say we talk about the fastest pitched baseball throw, or the speed of a tennis ball when Roger Federer hits a serve. We are speaking about the ball as a conglomerate, but there's no such thing as a ball in itself, because it's comprised of, again, individual atoms, and the atoms themselves are comprised of something else. And so any category that we speak about is always a conglomerate, and there is no essential substance that you can finally arrive down to. It's always going to be an admixture. And this is what we actually refer to as mithya. So let's say, my guru, Pujya Swami Dayananda Saraswati ji, used to give this perfect example. He said that, you take a shirt. From the standpoint of the person wearing a shirt, this thing is obviously a red polo. But then from the standpoint of somebody who's weaving it, all he or she sees is yarn. And then from the standpoint of the person who's actually picking the cotton, it is a certain fabric. And, it may even have a botanical classification for that plant. And so, if you even divide that further, from the standpoint of the constituents of the cotton fiber, you have carbon molecules, and this can go on endlessly. There's no end to it. And so whenever we speak about a single object, we have to keep in mind that we are not speaking about a single substance, we are always speaking about it in combination with other things. So this is the nature of mithya, that you can never arrive to the thing, to the vastu. And this vastu is what our shastra is really concerned about. And so that is something we look into further. So what is something then? We already discussed that there is no such thing that you can arrive at through a deeper funnel view, because it will always be replaced by something else. And so if we look at our journey through science, we've always considered that we've reached the essential substance. We've reached the final frontier of the very fundamental matter. And if we go back a few hundred years, when the microscopes became relatively complex in nature, they could actually see individual cells in plants and animals. And so they figured that this is the base substance. Even prior to that, if you look at what the Greeks spoke about and what our traditionalists spoke about, we had our own theory of the atom. And the word atom actually refers to indivisible. But in some sense, it is a very conceited term, because we know today that whatever their notion of the atom was, it is still further divisible into its own subcomponents. And so, okay, let's go back a few hundred years. So they thought that, okay, the cell is the basic foundational structure of a living being, and everything that walks, talks, moves is comprised of these indivisible cells. And then we went a little bit further in time, and then we figured that, okay, maybe it's not cells, maybe there are subcomponents of the cells, because you have organelles, you have DNA, you have chromosomes, you have all of these fancy things, that mechanisms that operate within the human cell or the plant cell. And so they figured, okay, maybe there's something to that as well. And then they came across this whole idea of molecules. And then we know that Einstein, in his 1905 paper on Brownian motion, arrived at something called the Browning effect, which established that there is actually something called an atom, which was in debate. So about 150 years back, there was actually a debate whether atoms exist or not. And so things get really gnarly when we think about it, because throughout history, our definition of what something is and what is the foundational structure of reality has continued to undergo certain transformations. And it is almost a scientific conceit to think that we've reached at the edge of reality, and we've uncovered the nature of what there is to discover. So everything is ultimately Nama Rupa. And that is what our Shastra says, that everything is a given name and form. There is nothing more to a substance than a name and form. Because the substantive, the very substance that is behind the object, does not belong to that object. It is only a name and form that's superimposed upon it. Just coming back to the example of a shirt, this is only a name and form. There is no such thing called a shirt, because a shirt itself is again made of yarn, and yarn is made of fiber, and so on and so forth. So depending on my vantage point, I can always replace the thing with something else. And if something can be replaced by something else, it makes us question the very nature and reality of the thing existing in the first place. So this is what we mean by mithya, and everything that is mithya is comprised of only nam and rupas. So now it's a very interesting phenomena, that ultimately, what is the substance of this physical world that we live in, that we interact with, that we perceive? And it is a manifestation of Ishvara's knowledge. And so the way to think about it is that, let's say, whenever you have some form of a creation, um, you're writing a computer code, for instance, there requires to be a programmer. Now, the place where this example falls apart is because when we think about a programmer, you think of a program that is independent of the programmer, that's going to be running and doing its thing and spitting out an output. Whereas what we are actually positing in the Shastra is that both, quote unquote, the program and the programmer are one and the same. There is no fundamental difference between the two. And it is this order, this law that pervades everything, that allows us to calculate and to form equations and to create correlations and to wield technology to our advantage through our understanding of science and nature, implies that there is some intelligence that is embedded within the cosmos itself. It is not a cosmos that is a random chance event. In fact, there's this whole atheistic notion about Occam's razor. So it is very applicable even for us, because it's a great logical tool to dismiss the nonsense from the sense. But what they imply is that, okay, this universe just came about through, um, let's say, a random quantum fluctuation. But then that begs the question that, okay, where did the fluctuation come from? then there are some people who posit that, okay, maybe there is something called a multiverse. And within this whole, you know, framework of multiverses, there are individual universes, most of which are not suited to support life, but ours just happen to be the one which is suited to support life. But then that begs the question, where did those multiverses come from, all of these others? And what was the causative factor that spawned this whole plethora of different universes? And so that way, you know, many of these atheistic, especially in the West, people have tried to come up with different models to explain how things exist and how they've come about, and why things are the way they are, and why certain properties are inherent to matter and reality. And they've only replaced the whole notion of Ishvara with some other inexplicable concept. And it requires as much, if not even more, Shraddha to accept those concepts than it does to accept Ishvara. Because there's again Occam's razor which is functioning over here, which is to say that if you have countless universes out of which one universe is capable of supporting life, it seems a little wasteful. It's a waste of real estate. It's a waste of space. It's a barrage on one's own intelligence, because that doesn't seem to make as much sense as understanding that there is intelligence embedded within the cosmos, and this universe is a manifestation of that very intelligence. Now, the reason we say knowledge is inseparable from the substance is because there has been a theory posited by a certain John Wheeler, who was a celebrated scientist. I believe he also won the Nobel Prize, if I'm not mistaken. And he was also the guide and mentor of Richard Feynman, who certainly was one of the greatest physicists who ever lived. And he came up with this nice, catchy phrase called "it from bit." So there's a whole branch of science that opened up in the last few decades, in the latter half of the last century, in fact, which is called information theory. And so usually one branch of science speaks about how matter is the foundational construct of reality, whereas this new theory, which is gaining a lot of traction, and it seems to explain many problems which were hitherto inexplicable, suggests that it is information that is at the base of all matter and not the other way around. And so this is very well, it's coherent even with what our Shastras speak about. And let's take one example of it. When we go to sleep at night and we have a dream, it is our memories that form the building blocks of the dream world. In in its essence, the dream world is indistinguishable from the real world, except for the fact that you wake up and then you can dismiss the dream as a dream. But while you're dreaming, the events of the dream are very much real. They are experienced to you. You experience love and fear and joy and hunger, insecurities, jealousies, all sorts of things that we experience in a waking state. We are also subject to those vagaries during our dream state, which is called the Swapna Avastha. But then it begs the question, where does the dream world arise from? Obviously, there is a certain ground that you walk on, and there's a sky that surrounds you, and there's air that you breathe, and there are people that you speak to, and they all seem distinct from you. And yet, it is our own memories that serve as the building blocks of the dream world. In other words, it is a knowledge content of the individual which is manifesting in the form of the dream, and then we enter the dream, and it appears as though the dream is external to us. And that's mind-boggling, but also very beautiful. Because if you take the same analogy and you extrapolate it to the physical cosmos, I won't exactly call it Ishvara's dream, because that gets a little um, um, hard to justify. But you can see that it is the knowledge content of this universal jnana, what you call Ishvara as Sarvagnya, as Sarvavit, because the entire knowledge content is embedded within the framework of what we refer to as Maya, and Ishvara is able to wield this Maya Shakti. It is this Maya Shakti which is appearing as the cosmos, just as the memories of the individual appears as the dream. And when you dream of a building, you don't have blocks stored in your brain. You don't have cement blocks and you don't have mortar and all of these things. You simply have your memories which are rearranging and organizing themselves in a certain fashion. So we are both the Nimitta Karana and the Upadana Karana of our dreams. We are the Nimitta Karana because what we perceive in the dream is a function of the memories that we have stored. We've all had this experience that sometimes if you undergo a certain traumatic event, if there's a death, if there is some sort of separation, some tragedy, maybe a breakup, whatever it may be, you may start experiencing some of those things in your dreams for at least the next couple of days, right? And the reason for this is again that there is a nimitta, there is a causality between our memories and the dream structure, the dream world, and likewise for the whole jagat. And so we will look into this a little bit further as well. So the next point I wanted to discuss is what is life. Usually, when we speak about life from the Abrahamic sense, life seems to be defined as a binary. That okay, there is something called living, there's something called non-living, and the living things have a soul, and the non-living things don't. In fact, it gets even a bit crazier in the Abrahamic sense because many believe that only humans have souls and not plants and animals. But okay, let's put that distinction aside. The point is that in the Western theologies and the Western philosophies, life has always been treated as a binary system, whereas this is not the case in Shastra. Now, the reason the distinction between inert and sentient is a moot case is because consciousness pervades everything. So when we refer to Ishvara and when we refer to Brahman as the very foundation of reality, there is a certain expression we use called Satchitananda. So the chit refers to consciousness. And when we speak of consciousness, that is what lends sentiency to all beings. So this inert versus sentient is actually a gradient. It is not a binary divide. There's no point at which something comes quote unquote alive, and there's no point at which something is inert. It's a gradient. And the reason we say that is because we have certain reflecting mediums. So let's take an example. Let's say we have light that is filling a room, and within that room you have different objects. Now the same light is going to shine on a lot of these objects, but some objects are much darker than the others and some objects are brighter, and some objects are like reflecting mirrors which completely show you the light the way it's supposed to be. And so one cannot say that there is a point at which the light is reflected versus a point at which the light is not reflected. The light is reflected across all of the objects, but some reflected more than the others. So same way when we speak about the idea of sentiency, about life, about living, uh, it is a degree of sentiency that is displayed in a given substance or in a given organism or in a given life form. And that is a very important distinction to draw. So yes, just as we discussed, like some mediums are better reflections of this pervasive consciousness. And the reason we seem to be displaying sentiency compared to, say, a rock or a pebble or a stone is because we possess something called a Sukshma Shrira, which is the subtle body. And that is what comprises of the mind. Let's put it that way. And usually there's a misconception that people say that when someone dies or someone is born, it is the Atma that is transmigrating. It's not the Atma, it is actually this Sukshma Shrira, this subtle body. And the subtle body is a quote unquote, again, a good reflecting medium to manifest consciousness. And that is what lends us sentiency. So this whole debate about whether something is living or non-living is a moot debate. It's a useless debate because that is not the way we look at the world at all. Everything is degrees of sentient in degrees of sentiency. Now let's see how this can create problems, especially in the Western dialectical systems. So obviously everybody by now is aware of the COVID virus, and it is a virus. And there is still a debate about whether a virus is a living being or a non-living being. This is a very heated scientific debate because people have agreed that, okay, there is something called a stone that's non-living. Sure. There's human beings, there's bacteria, there's plants, animals, all these things are living beings. Sure. What about a virus? And so till date, the West has not been able to effectively define what it means to be living. So, one definition somebody tried to pull is, okay, living is something that reproduces. But if you have certain abnormalities and deformities in crystals, those crystal deformities start spreading to other crystals as well, and vice versa. Same way, if you have fire, you can even refer to fire as a living being from the Western perspective of it reproducing. Because just as a living creature, we feed ourselves, we take in inputs from the world, and then we grow larger, sometimes we grow smaller as we age, but all of these things happen. Same way, when you feed fuel into the fire grows, and the fire is able to reproduce. You can have a spark that gets sent off somewhere else, and there's a smaller fire over there. And so this definition of living versus non-living by the standard of reproduction doesn't apply very well. And so every single notion that the West has tried to put about in terms of what is living versus non-living has led to a failure of understanding. Whereas we say that there is no such binary, there is only a gradient. And so that is the dharmic understanding of what life is. Now, the reason I spoke about this so far and this whole distinction between quote unquote inert and sentient is because every inert object that we perceive follows dharma by default. And this may not be very well understood at the very first glance, because what does it mean to say that an inert object follows dharma? What about an atom? Does an atom follow dharma? And the answer to that is yes, because there is a certain, if we go back to our original statement, the laws are also dharma. The fact that there is an electron which constantly orbits, well, not really an orbit, but let's say it's there's a probability distribution of an electron cloud which goes around the nucleus. That's not going to change. Things are going to be the way they are. It's because they are following their own dharma. Now they are not following it because there is a choice involved. By default, there is dharma involved over there. So same way, if you think about sentient creatures also, even within sentient creatures such as ourselves or plants or animals, there is also a gradient of free will versus impulse. So I want to take two steps back again to connect it to this statement. First, we spoke about the gradient between inert and sentient. And now within sentient creatures itself, there is a gradient between creatures who display free will versus those which are impulsive. So let's take an example, right? We are obviously free-willed creatures, which we will get to in the next slide, but let's take it as a fact for now that we exert and display free will because we have choice and we have volition. We can decide things whether they are right or wrong, whether they are good or bad, whether they are dharmic or adharmic. There's this whole discussion about should beef be banned in India, right? And so we can take a stand on that, and yeah, it probably should because for so and so reasons. Now, if you ask a tiger, first of all, you can't ask a tiger because you can't communicate with one. But let's say a tiger is not going to have the moral dilemma of whether it should eat a cow or a buffalo or whatever. It's just going to follow its own dharma because it has no volition over its diet. It's not going to suddenly eat a cow and start feeling guilty that, you know what, I think I contributed to global warming. It's not going to have that dilemma like us. And so, therefore, most creatures which don't display free will are following dharma by default because it is their pravritti and they don't have too much influence or too much volition over any of that, whereas we do. And so that brings us actually to the next topic, that what is karma? So far we looked at dharma as the overarching order. And from the standpoint of karma, the dharmic actions, so dharma is also the order, but there are also certain actions which are dharmic. And those actions which are in keeping with upholding this universal order is what you refer to as dharma also. And those are actions are subject to the laws of karma. So again, to reiterate the original statement, you have something called dharma, which are the inherent laws, and karma is an aspect of dharma which come under the purview of the karmic laws. So sentient beings also follow dharma by default, except with creatures of free will such as ourselves, so which is something we spoke about. And the free-willed creatures such as ourselves who are capable of exercising choice, it is we who are subject to the laws of karma. So the tiger is not going to draw any negative, positive, punya, pap, all of this based on its diet. Nor is the cow going to earn punya because it is purely vegetarian. Okay, that is its default mode. There's no dharma involved over there. It is doing dharma by default. Whereas for us, every choice we make, whether we are making a choice to vote in a certain fashion, vote for a certain leader, eat a certain food, say a certain thing to a certain somebody, all of these things come under the laws of karma because we have a choice over it. And not only do we have a choice, but we also have an understanding of the consequences of our actions. And then even within free-willed creatures who have a choice, I didn't mention this in the slide, but even there is an age factor. So, a 2-year-old who accidentally shoots someone with an air gun is not going to earn any pap karma because it has no idea what it's doing. But a 20-year-old, yeah, probably. And so there's an age gradient involved here as well, where our actions will earn a certain karma. And all of these come under the laws of karma, which itself is embedded within the larger framework of dharma. Now, karma is of 3 types. You have agami karma, prarabdha karma and sanchita karma. So here's how I give the example. Let's say sanchita karma is the entire collection of all the karmas that have ever been performed by an individual through countless lifetimes. We take this as an assumption because this is what Shastra says, that there's been anadi kala pravritti, which means that we've never not had a birth. We've always had a birth. The Gita mentions this, Upanishads speak about it. It's all over the place. So we take it. Now the prarabdha karma is the karma that we walk into this janma with, and the agami karma are the new karmas we generate within this birth. So the way we can analogize this is, let's say you have a bank. Now the sum total of your bank balance is everything that you ever earned. That is your sanchita karma. The prarabdha is like the wallet or the purse that you carry to go out shopping one day. And the agami is the stuff that you transact with. So our sanchita karma is the bag full of countless karmic pap karma, punya karma storage house. The prarabdha karma is that stuff that you come into this one single life with. And that prarabdha will determine many things in a big way and some things in a small way. For example, the person that you'll get married to, your gender, well, gender is, there's this whole debate, but I'm not even going to go there. I don't think everything is a social category. There are certain biological parameters that define gender as well, and sex and gender. But your sex is determined by your prarabdha karma, your body type, whether you're going to be genetically disposed to certain diseases, whether you'll be born to certain parents, whether you'll be born in a certain place, whether you'll undergo certain pleasurable and displeasurable experiences in life. The person you'll marry to, whether you'll have an inclination towards moksha, whether you'll be born in a certain family versus another. All of these things are determined by the prarabdha karma. Now, prarabdha karma are also of two types. I haven't quite mentioned it here, but it might be worth thinking about. One is called prabala prarabdha and the other is called durbala prarabdha. So the durbala prarabdha is the weak prarabdha that can be overcome through our free willed actions. And the prabala prarabdha are those very, very strong prarabdhas which have such strong impressions that you cannot really overcome it. So, for example, let's say there's a person who's 5'5". That's prabala prarabdha that's going to determine that you're never going to be a good basketball player, right? At the major league, at the national level, because people there are like 6'7", 7 feet tall, and so there are certain biological parameters that you can't overcome no matter what you try. You're never going to beat Usain Bolt in a 100-meter sprint if you are, say, not Usain Bolt, right? Because he has certain parameters that determine his success in life. And so the prabala prarabdha and durbala prarabdha are like two things that determine whether we'll be able to overcome it or not. Okay. And the reason we bring this about is the fruits of karma are handled by the cosmic laws. So when I perform an action, the action and the result is only separated by this notion of time. That's really it. I do something that is called a karma. I receive a result that's called a karma phala. And what separates the karma from the karma phala is samay, time or kal. And this time factor sometimes can be delayed. It can be after a few years, it could be in the next janma, it could be after 5 janmas, or it could be immediate. So let's say if I throw a ball up in the air and I catch it again, that's an immediate result. I don't have to wait for it. But let's say you go out on the street, you're driving on a motorcycle, you slap somebody on the road and you continue on. You may not get an immediate result, but there is going to be a time factor delay over there. And how it's going to come, when it's going to come, through whom it's going to come, in what form it's going to come, all of these things are intertwined. And this is what you call the collective prarabdha of all creatures, and that is handled by the cosmic laws. So the laws of karma are so difficult to understand. And I don't mean just these concepts, but to understand how a certain result comes from a certain action, that even in the Gita, Krishna Bhagavan says that you don't worry about that. You leave that calculation part to me. You just understand that these are the laws, and there are certain results associated with your actions. The way the karmic laws are handled is also dharma. And here's a very important thing. So oftentimes when we speak about dharma or karma and karma phala, one may wonder that, okay, is this kind of like the commandments in Christianity or Islam or wherever, where you do this so you'll get that, if you do that you'll get that, and so on and so forth. And the answer to that is no, because dharma depends on many things. There's something called desh kala vastu parasthiti. So it looks at the place, it looks at the time, it looks at the situation, and based on that it determines what your action should be. But then what determines whether something is going to earn punya or something is going to earn pap. This is a very beautiful, unique, and it gives goosebumps when you think about it. But that which preserves the cosmic order is what is going to earn punya, and that which disrupts the cosmic order is going to bring you pap. So let us take a few moments to reflect on what I mean by this order, or not what I mean, but what Shastra means by this order. When you think about the world around you, again, like when you study the physical world, there's physics involved. When you study the chemical world, there's chemistry involved. There's an order over there. You can't really disturb too much of that because we don't have so much control over like disrupting galaxies and so on and so forth. But now there's an order involved even in the world that we inhabit. There's a psychological order that an individual has. So agar, tomorrow I go and I give a gali to somebody ki tu pagal hai, or you're mental and there's something wrong with you and you're the worst person I ever know in my life, it's going to cause some psychological pain. And that is going to be a psychological disorder. It's going to create some pida that you call. And that pida is going to manifest as the law of karma, such that one day you will get a result for it because you've created a certain action and there will be a reaction as a consequence of it. Same way, that is the individual order. I'm blessed with the body. We are all blessed with bodies. But if we abuse the body, you eat all sorts of junk food every single day and you stuff your cheeks and you just sit like a couch potato. You don't get the right exercise. You don't take care of yourself. You don't do the right things. Ultimately, that result is going to add up and it's going to make you and or us an unhealthy, ill person who's not going to be able to enjoy the fruits of life. Then you have a family. There's an order involved in the family as well, because this is where things get dynamic. I, as an individual, play a certain role within my family. And there's a family dynamic that has to be maintained. The family dynamic rolls up to the community to the society to the nation to the globe. And all of these are manifest orders. In fact, not only the whole nation or the globe of human beings, but even ecological order, because my disrupting something in one place is going to create a disturbance in some other place. And so when we perform actions and we perform actions which are in keeping with this order, which preserve the order, we by default earn punya because it is handled by the cosmic laws. And when we perform actions which disrupt this order in any way, such as those protests that we see in JNU and other places, it creates a lot of disruption, and it disturbs the fabric of society, disturbs the fabric of the individual, it breaks families, it does a lot of harm, and therefore it is associated with pap karma. So I kind of skipped ahead a little bit to dharma and society, but we talk about three dharmas over here: samanya dharma, vishesha dharma, and swadharma. So many times, okay, chalo, let's talk about samanya first. Samanya dharma means common sense dharma. I should not hurt somebody. I should not steal from somebody. I should not go murder somebody. I should not go, I don't know, do things which are going to be obviously looked down upon by every single person with some common sense. That's Samanya dharma. Simple things that make you a decent human being, basically. Now, Vishesha Dharma are distinguishing factors within each individual. So, as a male, there are certain dharmas I have to follow. As a female, there are certain dharmas somebody else has to follow. As a son, there's a certain dharma. As a father, there's a certain dharma. As a mother, there's a certain dharma. Everybody has a certain type of dharma based on their different peculiarities. It could also be based on their gunas, it could be based on their profession, it could be based on their jati, it could be based on their interest, it could be based on many things. And so all of these Vishesha dharmas come into account. So in the Gita also, Krishna Bhagavan tells Arjuna that it is better to do your own duty imperfectly than to go do somebody else's duty perfectly. So if we take the example of a corporation, and let's say I'm an engineer, and I don't really like engineering too much, and there's an accountant, and I go tell the accountant that, you know what, you don't come to work tomorrow, I'll do your paperwork. It's not going to work well. I'll get fired for that stupidity, and I should get fired for that because I'm trying to do somebody else's dharma when I should be doing my own. And now this whole thing, in this whole my choice Deepika Padukone style generation that we've entered, there's this whole idea that Swadharma means doing what makes me happy. That is not true. Swadharma is a Venn diagram of Samanya and Vishesha Dharma. That which needs to be done by every member of society, and those peculiar dharmas that are unique to you, when you mesh them together, that determines what your Swadharma is. And yes, that also involves your likes and dislikes, but it is not the predominant factor. It is one of the um, secondary factors over there. So these are the three types of dharmas that we have, or categories, you can call it. Now, a society which adheres to dharma is prosperous. And I think this is more or less self-explanatory, because if everybody is doing the 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 needful, and everybody is playing their role effectively, and everybody is contributing to the welfare of every single level at which dharma is manifesting, from the individual to the family to the community to the society to the nation to the world to the ecology to the ecosystem, then we know for a fact that there is going to be the greatest good that's generated, and therefore a society which adheres to dharma cannot but be prosperous. And obviously, as an inverse idea, if dharma is not followed, we are going to disrupt the order, and that's going to create all forms of chaos. Now, when we speak about this imbalance, when we were in school, we had this example about what would happen if you destroy all the mosquitoes, because then the frogs would die out, because frogs and other creatures may consume mosquitoes. And it was a very simplistic example, obviously, but just to give an idea. And then if the frogs die out, then the snakes would their population would start dwindling. When the snake population starts dwindling, the rats would proliferate. When the rats proliferate, they will invade the granaries, and it will mess up our food supply. So it was just one example to show that when you disrupt the order in one place, it has a whip effect, and this whip effect carries over to other domains outside of that domain, and it creates a lot of imbalance in the world and society. And the fact of the matter is, however intelligent we think we are, we really are not, because we don't truly know the repercussions of our actions completely. We can't say for sure. There's this whole debate in China, in fact, about should we be seeding clouds to create more rainfall. And then there are certain imbalances associated with that as well. It can create certain pollutions, and we don't know how far this can travel. But the fact of the matter is that it is only creatures such as ourselves that are capable of creating imbalance, because we have free will. But imagine a world, and I'm not saying there should be a world like this, but I'm just saying that imagine a world without humans. The world would function relatively well. We are the ones who can quote unquote screw it up. And so, therefore, that's a bad thing, but there's also a good thing associated with it. We can also make it better. And that's a beautiful part, because we have that gradient of being able to mess up the world but also put it together, whereas other creatures who don't have free will can't do much about it. They just exist, whereas we thrive. We can thrive or we can destroy ourselves. That's a choice. And yeah, so this is basically what we spoke about, that we have the capacity to transform disorder into order, and that will earn even greater punya. Now, one of the principles of dharma is to maximize benefit and minimize harm. So that means, how can I perform actions that are in keeping with dharma, that benefit the maximum number of people over the maximum expanse of space through a very long time into the future, looking out for the long term delayed gratification sorts of benefit for the world at large. And so those actions are the ones which are dharmic, as opposed to the ones where you have instant gratification. This applies not only to society and to economic principles and to all sorts of decision making at the country nation level, but also to our individual lives. For example, who wants to go to college if there's nothing that's going to be at the end of it? Nobody wants to spend 4 years, 5 years, 6 years studying unless there's a reward. And so imagine a high school dropout compared to a college graduate. The high school dropout can say, you know what, 12th pass huna, what more do I need? I can get a decent job as a cashier somewhere. Fine, but then you have the rest of your life to think about. Whereas the other guy who's working hard for 4, 5, 6 years, he'll have a much better paying job, he or she, and can retire early and can do many good things and can contribute. And therefore, this thing about keeping in mind the maximum frame of time where the greater good is able to manifest is very much something that's part of our culture. And many times people question that, okay, why is it that when Indians go abroad, they tend to do better than other native communities in those regions? It's this delayed gratification idea, that you train and you kind of like take those hard knocks in life beforehand, so that later on you can be more or less stable. So okay, so this is one thing. And also, when we say maximizing benefits and minimizing harm, we're not talking about socialism, because that, in my view, is not a good system at all. It's a it's a very broken system. Because socialism, what it tries to do is it tries to replace fairness with justice. Oh, sorry, justice with fairness. And if we accept the laws of karma, that every creature, every person is deriving certain results of their own karmic fruits, then there's the sense of equal distribution does not really come into the picture. So that's a problem. Now, I want to, as a last topic, because I think we are coming close to the hour, is I want to discuss issues with secularism and in the context of dharma. Like, what exactly is the problem? Now, when we talk about dharma, we've spoken so much about it, and it cannot just be reduced to a single category like religion. So today, that is what we see being done, right? That okay, there's something called Isai dharma, which is Christianity. There's something called Muslim dharma. There's something called Hindu dharma. Dharma are not of different quote unquote types. Dharma is the order. So what these things, what you call Christianity or Islam or Sanatana dharma, they are uh, stark in stark contrast to each other. A theology is not the same as dharma. And so to use the word dharma as religion and only as religion is actually doing a great injustice. So because we speak about the secular narrative, the moment we use the word secular, reduce dharma to religion because it's going to look upon our Sanatana dharma as another religion. And that's a problem. Second is that when we use the word secular, we are mapping dharma to the Abrahamic framework. And the reason I say this is because secularism arose in medieval Europe, not medieval, a little bit after that, in order to combat the supremacy of the church. And this came about in the France and England region, where the church was actually dominating the royalty, and they were determining how people should live their lives, and there was a counterbalance of the king and the government officials who wanted to stop the intervention of the church in a person's life. And so they came about, there were revolutions, there were wars, and all were fought, and they finally came about with this idea of secularism, that there should be a separation, quote unquote, of church and state. So if secularism is a separation of church and state, how can it apply to dharma when dharma is the very foundation in the fabric of a society? So this whole thing about Sarva Dharma Sambhavana, or as some of my friends call Sarva Dharma Vadapav, because it's junk. It doesn't make any sense. And secularism attempts to divorce dharma from state affairs. The role of every single statesman, whether it's a leader, whether it's a prime minister, whether it's a havaldar, whoever it is their role to uphold dharma. Now imagine what is happening when we separate dharma away from the role of a state official to preserve dharma. Then we've created all sorts of paradoxes and problems in society. And so therefore, even this whole thing about secularism and dharma, it's an incompatible principle when we speak about the concept of Sanatana Dharma. And last topic, closing topic, in fact. Uh, so we've all heard Ahimsa Paramo Dharma. And there are two extreme opinions related to this statement. The people who have a very aggressive disposition, they say, nee, this statement is complete bakwas, it is complete junk. There's no such thing as Ahimsa Paramo Dharma. If we accept this, we will destroy ourselves as a civilization because we need to develop certain marital warfare type of framework to protect ourselves. That is also true, but it is not completely true. Then the second extreme is the false idealism, which says, yes, Ahimsa is Paramo Dharma under all situations. And this is the Gandhian disposition, where there's a false idealism which implies that there's never going to be a time of strife or war, and life is going to go on peacefully, and we should only practice non-violence at every single juncture in life. The correct way to understand Ahimsa Paramo Dharma, first of all, it is a true statement. It is there from the Mahabharata, and the way to understand this well is to look at the concept of global maxima and local maxima. So suppose, let's take an example. If I were to say that I have a knife in my hand and I stab somebody in the abdomen with the knife and I draw blood, would you call that dharma or would you call it adharma? And I think most people, it was adharma. But what if I said that I was actually on a battlefield and that knife was a surgical tool and I was using it to pull out a bullet from my comrade's abdomen? Now it is dharma. Given the right context, you can switch the understanding of dharma from adharma based on the situation, based on the time, based on the place. Now, if I did not stab that person, of course it caused a lot of pain, that stabbing process, but it would have taken the life of that person later on, because there would have been organ failure and a lot of other problems. So you need to remove the foreign object, you need to clot the blood, you need to stitch it up, all of these things. So therefore, this thing about global maxima is very important concept. Second is many people say, okay, why should you fight a war? War involves himsa. Is that not true? Of course it is true. There's a lot of killing, there's bloodshed, lives are lost, families are destroyed. War is bad. Then in that case, Krishna Bhagwan, who encouraged Arjuna to stand his ground and to continue fighting the Kurukshetra Yuddha, he would have been the greatest adharmi. But the answer to that is that that is only looking at a local situation. That yes, within the battlefield of Kurukshetra, between fighting a war and not fighting a war, the war is violent. But what if we extrapolate that across the whole Bharatavarsha and across time? Imagine the amount of violence that would have ensued had Duryodhana continued to stay as a leader, had he continued annexing and destroying other kingdoms, destroying the livelihood of the economy of society. And therefore, this war of the Kurukshetra was like the knife stab of the surgeon, the surgical stab in order to create a greater, longer term good. And that is what we mean by global maxima. So, ahimsa is indeed the paramo dharma, considering we look at the global maxima and not a local maxima. So on that note, I conclude this particular talk, and I will just close off with the Shanti mantra and hand it off to the host. Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnaat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Shri Guru Brahma. Hari Om.
Would like to ask you your journey. What drew you towards seeking this knowledge and to be so passionate about it? Could you give us a small life story, your personal life story?
Yes. So thank you very much. Because this is not a question I get asked often, and there's a very interesting story behind it. When I actually came to the US for my college, I grew up in a very quote unquote secular household, and temple going, mandir going would be once a year, maybe at most, if even that. And I did not have too much exposure to the tradition apart from what I saw my grandparents practicing, because they were very devout in their worship. But once I came to the US, something very interesting happened, which is my grandfather passed away under unusual circumstances. And I felt a little guilty about not spending too much time with him when I was actually in Mumbai. I went back and I partied with my friends. I did all the stuff I shouldn't have done. Then when he departed, I started questioning that, what happens when a person leaves this body? Is there an afterlife? What is this Atma? What is the self? What is the nature of reality? And so I started asking these very difficult questions to myself, and I was not able to find answers. So I figured I need to go to other people, and I tried to explore different things. I took a stab at different philosophies. I was not satisfied at the end of it, but through a series of what one may call coincidences, but I would say it's prarabdha karma. It was some stranger on the streets of Mumbai handed me a book of Vedanta teachings out of the blue. And I don't know who sent this, like why it happened, how it happened, so on and so forth. But that was the book I read on my journey back to the US, because I returned back for my summer vacations, and the rest is history. So bless that gentleman, like, who gave me these books, and that is when I got my first exposure to the teaching of Sanatana Dharma at the age of 2021, which is pretty late, but better late than never.
I think 2020, any age is good enough to start. But apart from that, one more thing I wanted to ask you is that though we are trying to put this narrative that, and we are trying to put it across that this should be taught in school and it should be taught, but we know that's really a far-fetched thought. But I would like to ask you, how are you passing it on to your children, and what do you see is lacking in today's parents, because the family plays a big role in passing on these wonderful traditions and knowledge. So what would you suggest? We can think about schools having it and beginning it and everything, but what are we doing as parents, and what are you doing personally, if you could just share that?
Yes. So I agree with you that there are many concerns. I myself have a lot of trepidation with regards to being taught in schools, because that implies that let's say our syllabus today is not quite adequate to pass on dharmic teachings. and there will always be a lot of controversy, and it's going to create a lot of problems. And it's better always to learn under a traditional guru, under a Ved Pathshala, under a Gurukulam, under um, more, I would say, governable um, situations where you know what's going on, as opposed to a school board. Now, the place, I think we are all faltering. The place where my own family has faltered, and I'm not saying that in a negative sense. It is a circumstantial thing. It's a product. We are all a product of our environment ultimately. And so, by not following our symbols and traditions, in fact, I had given a talk on the importance of festivals and culture. Many people today, I see, don't pay enough attention to their own history. If we understand the Indian history, we will see that we've been a very great and very strong civilization, in part because of our stability as a people derived from the dharmic principles. So it takes a curious mind to know what we stand for, and a curious mind is a very potent mind. So I would say parents, myself, others, we should develop more and more curiosity to know where we come from, so that we can pass it down to our children. The next thing is that we usually defer to the West when it comes to ideas. We somehow think that until and unless we are validated by the West, or until and unless it involves certain monetary gains, it's not worth knowing about. So today, I've been seeing in the news that these days in India, kids are learning how to code from the age of 5. But I don't see that discussion happening from parents that, okay, let's teach our kids Sanskrit from the age of 5, or let's teach them how to chant mantras from a young age. Let's enter them into Gita chanting competitions, Vishnu Sahasranam chanting competitions. All of these things are missing. The next thing is that many people I see, especially in the spiritual Adhyatmic world, they are making a grand mistake, which is to directly jump into Vedanta and the Upanishads, because the teachings of Vedanta are so abstract that it only starts making sense at a later stage in life. Once you've at least crossed your teenagers, or at least gone into college, not before that. But what keeps you grounded as a human being, as a person, as a Hindu, as a Sanatana Dharmi, are your symbols, your cultures, your Puranic stories, your Itihasas, your role models, such as looking at Sri Ram Bhagwan as Maryada Purushottam, looking upon Krishna Bhagwan as the Purna Avatara, looking upon Arjuna as the hero. Today we've replaced our heroes with the Marvel comic heroes. We care more about Iron Man, Superman, Spider-Man than we do about our great legendary figures who actually lived and who thrived in this country, and who passed on this great teaching to us. So my teacher used to say that the spirit dies without the symbol, and we've begun to chip away at the symbols of our cultural symbols. We've given up dharma for secularism. We've given up Gurukulam Pathshala for convent education. We've given up Diwali for Halloween. We don't celebrate Diwali as Americans in the US. Indians may celebrate it. I don't see white people and black people celebrating Diwali over here. Why should Indian people in Mumbai and Delhi have Halloween parties? Why should we have Christmas parties? Why should, I have many Hindu friends who go to the church to do Christmas mass. I don't see Christians going to the mandir during Navratri. So this thing about Western hegemony, where the Western perspective has taken over our lives and we start granting superiority to them and to seek validation from them, that also has to change. We have to adopt our cultural symbols. We have to wear them with pride. We have to not be guilty about being of a certain jati, which is what's being made prevalent today. And we have to stop carrying civilizational guilt, because Rajat Mitraji, who's written a great book on psychology about the infidel next door, and he spoke about what is it called, a post generational trauma. We've been traumatized as a nation of Hindus into thinking that we are an inferior species. And just as a person who is traumatized in life is not able to get through it without any external help, we have begun to seek validation externally in order to pull us out of this mess. Whereas we should start looking more inwards and finding out more about our own journey and passing it on to our children. So what I'm trying to do is, my daughter, I spend 10 to 15 minutes every single day with her doing my prayers. And then she will listen to me, and I don't care if she listens or not, I'll still do them. Because it's not so much about a 2-year-old paying attention, but the samskara will be formed. I subconsciously looked at my grandparents doing puja, and then that samskara formed in me. I didn't realize it would happen after 2 decades. So these, what do you call it? Subtle things matter a lot. And, a family that prays together, stays together is a true statement as well. Take your children to the temple, enter them in Bharatanatyam classes, enter them in Sangeet. because compared to like Western pop music, which is, and it's not necessarily bad, but Sangeet, you have bhajans, you have devotional stotrams, all of these things, it will have an impact. One controversial and unpopular opinion I would also give is get your kids into some form of martial arts, because I started karate in fact 2 weeks ago. I'm a very big kid now, but the reason is that it develops discipline. These days kya hota hai na, we don't have the respect for elders, but when you bow down to a sensei or a sifu, and when you're looking at them with a, there's an authority figure who's kind, who's helping you grow, who's forming discipline, who's helping you build your motor skills, it's going to be very helpful to you in all areas of your life. And I dare say, if a civilizational war breaks out, you will be prepared. You should not be afraid of drawing out weapons when required. So I know this is very unpopular, but it is a truth.
So it's not a question, it's just an observation, which, when I was a kid, while talking to my grandfather, we were just discussing something and he said that, no, dharyati iti dharma. Okay. And out of curiosity, I joined almost 5 minutes late this talk. But when I started going, you started saying all those things. I found that, yes, your indeed very in-depth research was summed up in that one sentence, which is dharayati iti dharma. But the other thing which I thought that, yes, our daily prayer and other things are a part of a dharma which is considered. And in Purusha Sukta, it is said that, sahasra shirsha purusha sahasraksha sahasrapata. And in that same Rig Veda, there is a question that kasmi devaya hamisha vidhema. That's where I tend to get lost somewhere, that how does both things are fitting in together in the same book. Could you please, if you can just explain it, or, thanks.
Sure. So can I ask you one question? The first one I understood, the Purusha Sukta, Sahasra Shirsa Purusha Sahasraksha Sahasrapat. Can you explain in Hindi the second one, please? Because I'm not that proficient in Sanskrit. If you explain it, I might be able to stitch them together.
किस देवता की पूजा करें हम, किस देवता को आहुति दें हम, कस्मै देवाय हविषा विधेम.
So the first in Purusha Sukta, this is very beautiful. In fact, I had that question for a very long time. So what does it mean that Sahasra Shirsha Purusha, like 1,000 heads are the heads of Purusha, 1,000 hands are the hands of Purusha, 1,000 feet are the feet of Purusha. So this Purusha over here is the same as Ishvara. And the 1,000 is only an indicator of koti, matlab countless. The 1,000 is just a placeholder number. And so because the whole jagat mein jo agar hum sapna dekhte ho raat ko, so whatever we manifest in our dream, you're talking to a dream person. For all we know, this could be a dream, somebody may pinch us and we'll wake up from it. It's possible. I'm thinking this is real, but you can only dismiss a dream when you wake up to reality. That's the point. And so every single head, every single foot, every single tail, every single creature in your dream is only you. That is a fact. So same with this whole jagat, whatever there is, every single thing, every single person, every single object, situation, time, place, whatever, is only a manifestation of that Purusha. So that is what that Purusha Sukta talks about in the beginning. And that's why it says that, everything came out from Purusha. The two-legged creatures, the four-legged creatures, the, the Brahmanas, the Vaishyas, Shudras, all of these things. Because it says that everything is Purusha, so everything came from Purusha. Now, which deity you should worship? There's a very beautiful concept in our Shastra of Ishta Devata. So this may or may not be part of Ramayana. I don't think it is part of Ramayana, but it's a later story that somebody made very beautiful. And so when Ram Bhagwan goes to Rameshwaram, he builds Shivalinga to Shankar Bhagwan, which he calls Rameshwaram. And so he tells Shankar Bhagwan that, see, you are Aap Ram ki Ishwar ho, therefore Rameshwara. The same Sanskrit word can also mean Ram is Ishwara. So Shankar Bhagwan says, nahi, Aap Ishwar ho, therefore Rameshwara. So both of them are praising each other. Now Vishnu Sahasranam, there's another thing that Parvati Vacha, Kimekam Devatam Loke, Kimvapyekam Parayam Shtumantaf Kamkavanchanta Prapnur Manuvashubham. So then Shankar Bhagwan in there, Ishwara Vacha, Shri Rama Rama Rameti Rame Rame Manorame Sahasanama Tatulyam Rama Nama Varane. So throughout our granthas, there's very beautiful thing I observed is if you read the Shiva Purana, then Shiva will be held superior and Vishnu and Brahma will be inferior. If you read the Vishnu Purana, Vishnu is superior, everybody else is inferior. And so what all the Puranas are doing, because they are all a product of Ved Vyasa, he cannot be a mad guy. Therefore, what he's trying to show is that everybody is Ishvara, depending on who your Ishta Devta is, what your family lineage is. If you're a Shaiva, Shiva is superior. If you're Vaishnava, Vishnu is superior. And there is no infighting between the two. There's also a very beautiful verse. I can't quote it, but I know it's there in the Bhagavad Purana, I believe, or some Purana. It says that whoever does tulna between Brahma, Mahesh, and Vishnu will get stomachache, something like that. So they themselves, the Puranas themselves say that don't contrast and compare the Devtas, worship the one that is part of your lineage, that you are most comfortable with. And there are two factors. One is कि what does your family follow? आपका परिवार का क्या background है? और second is कि आपकी इष्ट देवता कौन है?
It was great listening to you. You try to make things very simple, a very fairly complicated set of rules of dharma and karma, which people find very difficult to understand. Sir, I'm grateful to you for this. I also talk to children about these two issues of dharma and karma almost every second, third lectures. Here, one point which I find difficult to explain is that the time taken between an action and the fruits of the action, which can come after a month, come after 2 months, or it can come after 2 years, or sometimes it does not seem to come at all, especially when people are doing, बोलते हैं अरे इतना खराब आदमी है, इतना खराब चीज करता है, and he is very happy. Then it becomes very difficult to tell the children and convey to them, you have to be a little patient and you will find so and so suffering. And we are also not able to equate one action with a specific result. Now, how can we, could you tell me how we could sort of deal with this problem of explaining?
Pranam Karul Sahab, thank you very much for the question. Yes. I have thought about this a lot, and I usually come up with these very funky thought examples or thought experiments. So there's one way in which this can be nicely explained. Imagine hypothetically that there is a person on a deathbed. They have maybe like 10 seconds to live. But in those last 10 seconds, for whatever reason, the guy takes a gun and shoots the doctor. And then the guy dies. The result has to follow that person somewhere. Therefore, we say that it follows in the next life, because this life does not have enough time for the suffering to take place based on that consequence. So that is one way to explain that if the world is fair and if the laws are fair, the result has to come. And therefore, if you commit a heinous crime towards the very last second of your life, where does the result go? So that is one extreme example in which one can rationalize it. There's another example where this, I believe, a Westerner had asked the Sringeri Jagadguru or Kanchi Jagadguru, some Jagadguru, ki, how do you explain this thing about reincarnation and rebirth and all? Like, what does it mean? So the Jagadguru did not give an answer directly. He said, do one thing, tomorrow go to the children's maternity ward in the hospital and come back to me and then we'll discuss. So then that guy went over there, the Westerner. And then he saw that there were some kids who were born healthy, some born disabled, some born with certain conditions, whatever, genetic issues. And so then he realized that, see, if the world is the way it is, and it is supposed to be a fair world governed by certain laws, then why should there be a disparity between the births of children also when they have not committed any actions in this life? They have not done anything to deserve it in this life. Therefore, one says that the karma carried over from the previous life. So in the first example, we saw that an action that you perform, like the shooting of the doctor, will carry over to the next life. And here we see an example of the karmas carrying over from the previous life. Now, as to why there is a delay and what is the delay, whether it's a 2-day, 2-month, as you said, what is the delay factor and what determines that? This is something related to the theory of complexity, which I believe that our karmic teachings explain perfectly well. So if I may speak for a couple of minutes on this, it's very insightful what I learned. We have something called a two-body system. So suppose there are only two things in the whole universe. There's the earth and the moon, nothing else. There's no sun, Jupiter, nothing. then it is very easy for us to put that into a computer and figure out what will be the exact, almost exact location of the moon's orbit after like 10,000 years or 20,000 years or 30,000 years. We can say with confidence when the next eclipse will be after 50,000 years. But the moment you introduce a third body into the system, such as even a thing like the sun or Jupiter or whatever, the equation starts breaking down because it becomes more indeterministic. And this is what you call the three body problem. Now imagine that we live in this world which is embodied by countless living forms, not just three, but countless. There are more bacteria in our intestines than there are humans who have ever lived on the planet. And everywhere around us, there's a proliferation of life. And every one of these life forms comes with its own history of past karma. If something happens to me today, it's not going to affect only me, but it's going to affect my parents, my wife, and my daughter, and everybody. And so every result that a person undergoes has to be somehow managed within the result that the other people in that environment also experience. And therefore, there is to consider all of these complexities at once. That is why there is a time factor delay, and that time factor is all handled by Ishvara's equations, the karmic laws.
There's a follow-up question to that. Like you said, that people carry their, their karmas in the next birth if it's not able to complete in this birth. Similarly, one of our audience members asked that does it carry on to our future generations? Like I will suffer my karma, but will it also pass on to my generations?
Very beautiful, very nice question this is. And the answer to that is no, but it may look like that. And the reason it is no is because let's say I perform a certain wrong action. Or let's say I don't do puja of my Kuldevi, or I displease my Kuldevi, or something of that sort. Let's put it that way. It is not my negligence of action that is going to be transferred over to my child or grandchild or whoever. Rather, based on their karma of actions that they themselves have brought about, they will be born in this situation, which will give a result for their own actions. So that means that from one perspective, it may look that I am the cause of their suffering, but the right perspective is that they themselves have brought themselves into this environment to undergo the results of their own actions. So, but the pida is going to come to me ultimately, because I am the one who is going to suffer to see my children, grandchildren suffer, and therefore it is my own accountability. But it doesn't transfer over.
Thank you, Prashantji. One more question that I received via the chat is that the bad karmas that I do, is it because it gets impressioned in my mind and that's why it carries on to the soul? Is it the way how it works?
There are two factors to it. So every karma has something called karma phala, and the karma also leaves behind a samskara. I think very visually. So the way I think about it is that imagine that you have a nice plush sofa. If a person has sat on it for a while, there will be a compression. You'll see that there's an indentation on the sofa, and then after a point, the sofa starts lifting again. It becomes normal after a few hours. But when somebody has got up, that indentation is there. When I perform a given action, I will get the result of that karma also. But along with it, one of the results manifests as a samskara or a vasana in my mind, which is like that compression, that indentation. And therefore, I'm more prone to perform that karma again. Let me give a few examples of what I mean by that. Let's say I have never ever tried something in my life called dosa. And I go to this Udupi restaurant and I try dosa for the first time. Then I really like the taste. Now I want to go again, and I want to go again, I want to go again, I want to go every day for breakfast. But if I had never tried it, I would never want to do it because that samskara had not been formed. Another example is that imagine that you have a perfect cone and you're dropping water on top of it. Now the first drop is going to determine the sequence of all the other drops, and it's going to become a river eventually, because the first drop will pull the others, and so on and so forth. So therefore these vasanas are ultimately formed. And so those are the two results of the actions. That if I do a pap karma, it's going to leave a negative vasana behind, and it's also going to generate a negative karma that I will suffer. And I'm also more prone to doing that. Now let's take another example of addiction. People we know are addicted to primarily three things, right, in life. One is you might be addicted to drugs or alcohol or something. You might be addicted to video games. You might be addicted to pornography. These are the three problems that people usually face, and many other addictions. But as you do more of that action, the addiction actually grows stronger and stronger and stronger. And so not only do you get the karma phala of it, but you are actually more prone to doing those same karmas repeatedly. And the only way to break out of it is by to break the loop. And when you start breaking the loop, that decompression effect happens where the sofa gets raised again. And then you lose that drive to go down that route. And so the only way to actually counter these karmas is by doing, this is what you call pratipaksha bhavana. That means that do the opposite of what you're trying to get rid of. So suppose I'm a very conjuice person, I don't like spending money, and I'm like, have a very tight wallet, tight pocket. Then maybe once in a while, just for the sake of it, I should go out on the streets and do some charity, just for the sake of it, even if I don't feel like doing it. Because my guru says, fake it to make it. In the beginning, you may just like hand out food packets to people because you think you should do it. But after a point, you'll start smiling, and then you'll want to do more and more of that. So that fake it to make it principle is very important. Suppose you're very jealous about somebody's success. That, "Arey, isne itna paisa banaya, look at me, I'm such a loser in life." But for a moment, just go and thank that, congratulate that person that, what, good job. I think you've done really well and you deserve it. That person is obviously going to compliment you back and thank you in a good way. And then you'll actually feel happy for the person. So that pratipaksha bhavana is a very beautiful way to counter papa karma and to start doing the right thing so that you build punya, a balance of punya karma.
See, talking about the Hinduism, I've always watched from 50 to 70 years, we have seen different type of Hinduism. Okay, we're just going to temples, okay, chanting the God name. You can say that's just the Hinduism. Okay, now we can say. So what is the perspective of it? And we can say we are talking about dharma, but the people in the people's mind, there is adharma. Okay, the families are breaking. We have many of the things we can see. That's adharma only, we can say. So what's the reason for it?
If I understand the question, are you, Devanshi, is it like, what is the reason for adharma?
See, like some families are breaking. We are means dahej le rahe hain hum. There are many things. Okay, like we are thinking good for the people. Okay, but inside we are very jealous about them.
Right.
And it's not only in one two areas. It's, you can say, whole Hindi community is like that. You can say today, and our gurus are also supporting it. You can say.
Gurus are, sorry?
Supporting it. Okay, like be good yourself, not be others.
So see, the reason for, like, if we go back philosophically, the reason for any adharma is actually in avidya. So there's one very beautiful teaching in the Gita. It says, Dhyayato Vishyam Pumsah Sanghasteshu Pujayate Sangat Sanjayate Kama Kama Krodho Bijayate Krodha Bhavati Sammoha Sammoha Smriti Vibramaha Smriti Brahmshat Buddhinasha Buddhinashat Pranashyati. So what this means is ki the first instance of adharma that we begin to commit is by some inkling, some minor attachment to something or the other. So let's say, you're let's assume you're married as a guy, and you're walking down the street every day to work, and you always see this very attractive shopkeeper. And first time you'll walk, and for 1 second you'll turn your gaze, and then you'll continue walk. Second day you'll go, your gaze will last a little longer. Third day you'll go a little longer. Fourth day you'll actually enter the shop to speak to the person, right? So what happens is that the first thing, Dhyayat Vishaf Punsa Sanghas Teshu, that Sangha, that small bit of association, Teshu Pujayate Sangat Sanjayate Kama. From there, that flame of desire starts to develop from the mild association. And then from there, things such as anger, Kama Krodho Bijayate. Why does anger happen? Because you go talk to that girl, and instead of like responding nicely, she comes and slaps you. So then there'll be anger. I wanted something good out of it, and I got this instead. So the anger. Or suppose you do get what you're wanting, then it leads to lobha, greed. So if I don't get what I want, I become angry. If I get what I want, I become greedy because I want more and more and more of it. And then krodha bhavati sammoha. Sammoha matlab I get deluded. Once you get angry, you become delusional. You lose control over your senses. You lose control over dharma versus adharma. So the reason I'm mentioning this progression is because it's a very beautiful psychological progression. And also at the same time, this, when you spoke about dharma and adharma and why we are more prone to adharma, is because at some point in our progression, we've lost the way. So therefore that sammoha has taken place. Sammoha, smriti, vibhramaha. Smriti are the shastras, the good teachings, the good lessons that we've accumulated in our life. They get lost. Vibhramaha, matlab it's confusion all over the place. Smriti Bhramshat, when the good things that you've learned get destroyed, the entire buddhi gets destroyed. Buddhi nashat, and when the buddhi gets destroyed, pranashati, it leads to utter and complete destruction. So all forms of problems in society, all issues, all concerns that we find today are a consequence of not knowing the distinction between dharma and adharma, and to misuse our capacity to choose between the two. When we choose adharma for dharma, then we will create chaos and there will be all sorts of complications.
Namaste, Prashantji. So my question is basically, it actually comes from the last thing which you just talked about. Do you consider fasting to be a good way to control maybe greed, as well as addiction, which you just mentioned about? And I actually also have another question. So do you want me to ask it right away, or maybe just once you answer this question?
Sure. I might forget the first one. I might ask you again, but
Okay. So the second question is basically, just like you mentioned that our maybe our karmas or our bucket of karmas will actually form as a part of our choices which we have made throughout our lifetime. And being a part of Sanatana Dharma, we actually believe that ahimsa is our dharma, ahimsa paramo dharma. So being a disciple of Jainism, I've always learned that we really have to consider every other life equal to ours, and hence we should follow the vegetarian diet, so on and so forth. But I've seen many people who are following Sanatana Dharma. Let's take the example of Rajputs, but they don't really believe in vegetarianism that way. So I just wanted to understand what actually gave a way to these different thought processes in the Sanatana Dharma itself. Thank you.
so I already forgot the first one, so I'm going to start with the second one. Sorry, I have a memory of a goldfish, but so let's start with the second because it is actually much longer. And are we short on time? I just want to confirm. 5 minutes, 7 minutes, something. Okay. So the thing is, ahimsa is indeed paramo dharma, but if I may mildly disagree with the concept of ahimsa in Jainism, and I can tell you why. During my secular days, I mentioned that I explored certain philosophies. The first one that I spent 2 years studying is actually Jainism before I found some problems. But the reason I say this is because ahimsa paramo dharma has to be interpreted in a certain fashion, and the Jain interpretation is called paripurna ahimsa. It means that you should practice ahimsa at a local and a global level, and you should never participate in anything that creates any form of local harm also. And what we say, especially in the teachings of dharma, is that in order to preserve the global maxima, you need to sometimes do some himsa at a local level. So, for example, Jaina Darshana came about through the Shramana Dharma. Shramana Dharma matlab the sannyasi sort of ascetic lifestyle. And because it came about mostly due to as an ascetic religion, it did not completely codify the duties of a householder or of a soldier, of a warrior, of all of these people. And therefore, there is a missing piece over there. It is very good when it comes to sannyasis, but it is not so applicable to non-sannyasis. Now, even within Sanatana Dharma, within what we call like these days Hinduism, the sannyasis are supposed to follow Paripurna Ahimsa the same way the Jains follow it. Except that in Sanatana Dharma, there is a distinction between the dharma of a sannyasi and the duty of a grihastha. So as our Colonel Ji also, who is over here, would attest that, sometimes when we fight wars and we have to create certain bloodshed, it is for the greater good. Today, if you have insurgents coming in from Pakistan who are invading Kashmir, our soldiers need to go into battle and to destroy them. So that is one point. Second point is that if you look at this all life forms be equal, that is also, I don't know if Jainism actually believes that, but I don't think it does. But Sanatana Dharma certainly does not accept that. The value of a certain life form depends upon the indriyas that it has, and also within that there is a gradient. For example, let's say today we eat a plant. We all consider eating plants safe. Whether you're a vegetarian or non-vegetarian, you will eat plant because they are the primary producer. They are also ekindriya jivas because they only have the sense of touch. They don't have the other senses associated. And the fewer indriyas that you have, the fewer himsa is, the lesser himsa is involved in its consumption. Second point is the plant, why it's more dharmic to eat a plant, and I don't mean to offend any non-vegetarians, but I'm giving you an ecological reason, is because it is a primary producer. It uses the least amount of resources and it only relies upon water and sunlight. And this whole through the photosynthetic process, you're able to derive glucose, and that becomes your nutrition. So the plant is actually ecologically the most efficient form of life to consume for our sustenance. When you eat an animal, there is something called entropy that is being lost. So, when we go to the doctor to check our fever, if it's above 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, we say there's a fever. Constantly, we are actually glowing in the infrared spectrum at the intensity of a 100-watt light bulb every second. That is how much energy output we are giving out through heat, body heat, that is. So therefore, the animal, suppose you eat a chicken or you eat a cow or you eat a goat or whatever you eat, the amount of calories you'll get from there, the animal would have eaten a lot more calorie content in terms of plant in order for you to get a little bit of content in terms of animal. So you're actually wasting that through entropy. And you're using up a lot of land, a lot of resources, a lot of water. You have to nullify the acids when the blood is released before it gets into the river. A lot of problems are there. Sanitary problems, slaughterhouse mein bahut problems hote hain. So therefore, it is not very ethical to eat animals for a different number of reasons. Okay, so therefore, we all agree on that part. Now, I will make one caveat. Suppose you are a human being that lives in the North Pole. We know कि वहाँ कुछ झाड़ बाड़ नहीं उगता. It's only you have to probably fish. So what these Eskimos do is they'll bore a hole into the ice and then they'll let down their whatever bait and then they'll eat the fish if they find some fish. So in those rare circumstances, it is good because you have no other option. Another example is that suppose you live in coastal areas or in an island or whatever. So over there, what happens is two things. First of all, the water is saline, so you cannot do agriculture very easily. And second is you have to rely on the fish content. So okay, chalo, in certain coastal areas, if necessary, you can eat. And that also there's a gradient that is better to eat fish than it is to eat a goat or a chicken or whatever, because there's a distinction involved over there. And lastly, let's say there's a supply chain problem involved, which means that if you live in the US or if you live in India or wherever you live, but you're ordering imported vegetarian food, like there's a grain called quinoa, which is very popular these days in the US and it is grown in South America. So are you creating more pollution by consuming quinoa non-locally than you could be by maybe eating some non-vegetarian food locally? It's a good question. That's what I mean to say. So there's an algorithm over here or a heuristic, which means that if possible, be as vegetarian as you can under all possible circumstances. But if there are exceptions, you can accommodate them. But those exceptions have to be real exceptions and not excuses. Like if you're a North Pole, that's an exception. It's not an excuse. I forgot your first question. I'm sorry, as I thought I would.
That was a really nice explanation. But actually, I just wanted to understand the distinction between some disciples of Sanatana Dharma being okay about having non-veg as one of their meals, and whereas the example was for the Jainism again, that they very strictly follow that we have to be abide by non-violence when we make our food choices. And the first question was about fasting being yes.
Light bulb. Certain communities in Bharat, Hindu communities do consume meat because of family tradition, because of habit and all. I may not necessarily agree with that, to be honest. Again, like let's take an example of our ancient times. But there were certain instances, somebody told me, let's say it's a tentative fact, I'm not sure of it, that the Pandavas and Ram Bhagwan and all ate meat in the forest when they were in Vanvas and all of these things. I say those are very exceptional circumstances. Today, if somebody puts me into a forest, forest mein you can't eat anything. First of all, you don't know what plant is going to kill you. Half of the leaves there are not edible, and some of them are poisonous. It's very difficult to know. Of course, there's no agriculture in the forest. So what do you rely upon? Sometimes you may have to rely upon animal product. If you are stuck in a forest, these suppose you have kshatriyas, suppose you have soldiers, you are at the high altitude, you are fighting at a glacier, you are fighting in Kashmir, maybe there's no vegetarian food available around there. Those are exceptional circumstances. You may need to eat more meat, and also to keep your protein content high. It's acceptable under those very rare instances. When I say rare, it's like less than 1% of the population. But now if somebody goes to KFC, or if you're a Rajput, which is supposed to be a Kshatriya, or you're a Jat, you're supposed to be a Kshatriya, and you go to KFC, you go to Domino's, you go to McDonald's, you start eating meat over there, that is not justifiable. It's a very lazy excuse, I would say. So those things should not be, I wouldn't say tolerated, because we're not trying to be intolerant, but those things should be questioned very, very strongly. And the first question about fasting, does it help build willpower? Was it like, does it, what was the fasting?
So the fasting, I wanted to ask about whether it is a right way to maybe control one's greed or addiction in some way.
It's a good way. It's not the only way, but it's definitely a good way. And the reason is that when a person is fasting, there's a very nice smell coming from the kitchen, and everybody else is eating, and you are like, your stomach is grumbling, and your mouth is watering, you're salivating all over your keyboard. And to desist from eating even during that time actually builds some discipline. It builds some willpower. It is what you call sankalpa shakti, and that sankalpa shakti is I would say it's one of the greatest blessings that a person can have. Sankalpa shakti basically means doing what I've decided to do. In short, if मैंने किसी का धैर्य लिया है कि ये करना है तो मैं करके रहूंगा या रहूंगी, that is your sankalpa shakti, and that carries over in every form of your life. So suppose you say you're addicted to alcohol. I'm not saying you are, especially if you're a Jain, you're not. But if you're addicted to alcohol, then that sankalpa shakti that you develop through fasting will actually allow you not to consume the alcohol or to consume the meat or whatever. I know some people, like I've spoken to this whole meat thing argument, that I've gotten a few people off meat, by the way, because I explain things to them. Sometimes I'll put a little bit of healthy pressure also. And then they come back after a few weeks saying that, I'm struggling so much. This is so tempting and all. But then I tell them, okay, you persist for a few weeks and then it'll become easier. It becomes easier. After a point, they give it up. A desire and an addiction will lose hold in time. So